Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us today. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Catalina Onís is an assistant professor in the University of Colorado Denver's Department of Communication. Mora Matassi, a doctoral candidate at Northwestern University and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Catalina in just a minute. I'm delighted to note that this quarter, our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, the Latina and Latino Studies program, and the program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go into the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about native peoples and institutions' history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Mora will tell us more about Catalina's research and career in just a few seconds. Then Catalina will deliver her seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen. At any point in time, Mora will moderate after Catalina finishes with her presentation. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Mora, the screen is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pablo, thank you so much for having me as moderator for today's edition of the virtual seminar series. It is an absolute honor for me to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Catalina Onís is an assistant professor in the University of Colorado Denver's Department of Communication. She holds a BS in journalism with a minor in Spanish from Northwestern University, an MA from the University of Montana's Department of Communication Studies, and a PhD from Indiana University's Department of Communication and Culture with a minor in Latino Studies. Dr. Onís researches and teaches environmental and energy communication and Latinx communication informed by rhetorical studies. She has published her research in many journals, including communication monographs, communication theory, environmental communication, social justice, a journal of crime, conflict, and world order, and the North American Congress on Latin America report, as well as in several edited collections, including Racial Ecologies and the Routledge Companion to Motherhood. One of her essays on Puerto Rico and the Hurricane Maria aftermath received the 2019 Bill Eddy Top Scholarly Article Award for the National Communication Association's Applied Communication Division. She also received the 2015 Feminist Scholar of the Year Award for her article on reproductive justice, borders, and translation in women's studies and communication. Dr. Onís has written several books to reach multilingual audiences of all ages. Some of these projects she will be discussing in her seminar today. Dr. Onís co-authored the Spanish language book, Ustedes tienen que limpiar las cenizas e irse de Puerto Rico para siempre, la lucha por la justicia ambiental, climática y energética como trasfondo del verano de Revolución Boricua 2019, which addresses long-time environmental, climate, and energy struggles in Puerto Rico and their connections to the mass mobilizations in the archipelago in summer 2019. Dr. Onís is also the author of Energy Islands, Metaphors of Power, Extractivism, and Justice in Puerto Rico, awarded with the 2021 Tarla Ray Peterson Book Award in Environmental Communication. Most recently, she co-authored La Justicia Ambiental es para ti y para mí, a bilingual children's book that introduces young readers to the concept of justicia ambiental. Without further ado, no, I have to say something really important. As part of her coalitional contributions, Dr. Onís has produced a documentary with local community members in Puerto Rico about grassroots struggles for solar comunitario. This is entitled El Poder del Pueblo, una lucha colectiva por la vida y el medio ambiente, The Power of the People, a collective struggle for life and the environment. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Catalina M.
Muchísimas gracias por esta introducción. Feliz Año Nuevo. Thank you so much to you all for being here and for the very warm welcome and introduction. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen with you all. And we'll put this in slideshow mode, so hopefully you can see the slides fully. It's an honor to be with you as we begin these early days of January, and I am speaking about anti-colonial energy justice, as well as the important role of translation. And the projects I'll engage are several that Mora had mentioned. And I wanted to begin by thanking Mora and Pablo, and I also had the joy of meeting and speaking with Val Gruest and Facundo Suenzo before this event started. So these individuals have all been integral planners of this event. So thank you so much. And I also want to talk about the peoples who daily engage in anti-colonial and decolonial struggles. The University of Colorado's campuses occupy the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations, among others. And of course, this statement is not a substitute for material actions to support Indigenous sovereignty and reparations. And in particular, I wanted to call attention to the important Red Deal, which offers anti-imperial and anti-colonial approaches to trying to create more sustainable environments, and also the land back movement. So some very important efforts that are being led by Indigenous peoples for decolonial presence and futures. And I also wanted to highlight this too, because these decolonial struggles are so central to the efforts in Puerto Rico that I have worked to try to support from my diasporic position in coalitional ways. And so in particular today, I'm going to focus on the Hobos Bay community in Puerto Rico. So I have a map later that I'll be able to show you. And I wanted to acknowledge in particular two women who have been amazing collaborators throughout the different projects that I do. So this first would be Licenciada Ruth or Tata Santiago, and the other individual is Mabet Colon Perez. So you'll be hearing about them later in the presentation. And I also certainly acknowledge many amazing collaborators in the US diaspora and beyond. So it's so good to be with you all. And often when my name appears as the sole author, that's not actually the case. These are collaborative projects, and they're very much shared energies in these struggles for more livable coexistences. And so today, and what I'll be speaking about, I'm first going to talk about the importance of archipelagos. So thinking about them in a figurative sense, but also materially. And then I will shift to contexts of struggle in co-creating alternatives, as well as the text or the rhetorical materials that are so important in constituting these struggles. And then I'll go ahead and emphasize and highlight three projects that are responding to the different realities of various actors and activists in the southeastern region of the largest island of Puerto Rico that I'll be talking about. And many of the images that you'll see today have been created by the talented Puerto Rican artist Mabet Colon Perez, who again you'll get to meet shortly in my presentation through her words and ongoing artwork contributions. So to begin in thinking about archipelagos, you can see here that there are these islands, and then together there's this formation that's constituted. And as I think about the many injustices, emergencies that we face today, and also their very disproportionate impacts on low income, low wealth, Indigenous, Black, and other people of color communities, it's important to note that not all of these experiences are encountered equally. And so you can see these different dialectics or tensions that are on this screen. And so crisis and care is certainly a tension that's been discussed a lot in environmental communication circles. And I especially want to acknowledge Dr. Phaedra C. Petzulo, who has really emphasized the importance of this. And these other dialectics I would like to add as well in thinking about how to survive and struggle to live good lives in these times. And so in thinking about these concepts in relationship to archipelagos, in my book, which I'll talk about shortly, I developed this concept of archipelagos of power. So thinking about islands as these different nodes that together constitute an archipelago. So this can both be for oppressive relations, so thinking how different systems and structures and actors and groups can come together to create these oppressive forms of power, and then also how those who are resisting and co-creating alternatives can also come together in their little islands, their nodal points, to create an archipelago of a different world, a different planet. So hopefully that's of interest and generative as we continue to think about this presentation and some of the questions and ideas and issues that you are all grappling with as well. So in thinking about the archipelago of Puerto Rico, you can see here that there's the largest island, and then there are some other islands as well that are smaller in size. And so the region that I'm going to be focusing on is the Salinas Guayama region here. And you can see that there's a bay here, and this is La Bahía de Hobos, or the Hobos Bay. So when I'm referencing particular areas, this is something to note as we continue on with the presentation. And in Puerto Rico, there are many compounding crises. And as I share these and walk through them, I wanted to be sure to note the important insight from Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck, which is this idea that damage or trauma-centric narratives can be very limiting and a problem if that is the only way that different communities are portrayed. So I certainly want to highlight the problems because it helps to explain why different groups and individuals are resisting and building alternatives as they are, but I also don't want to dwell in them and have them be the only way that we think about Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico has been a colonial US territory since 1898. Before that, 1493 and beyond, it was a colony of Spain. Racial capitalism has been a key force in incentivizing outside investment and violently displacing people intergenerationally, particularly laborers in the sugarcane industry and other industries are key sites of that. There's also a debt burden that mainstream news media has portrayed in particular ways, in addition to some of these other issues that have made, and this debt has made life incredibly difficult for so many people because it also has been involved with a number of neoliberal austerity measures. So in 2016, the Promesa legislation, which was an act, it installed the Fiscal Control Board, or La Junta, as it's called locally, which makes all kinds of top-down decisions that have made life incredibly difficult for so many people as they make these very dictatorial decisions economically. In addition to these issues, there have also been hurricanes, of course, which were well publicized with Irma and Maria in 2017, but Puerto Rico has a long history of hurricanes. What's most significant with climate disruption and its brutalities is that those hurricanes are increasing in severity and frequency. There also were earthquakes that were rumbling through the southern coast in late 2019. And these temblores have persisted for many years, but were especially horrible in their devastation in early 2020. There are also a number of corrupt energy politics that are going on with these no contract or no bid deals for how to fix the electric energy system in Puerto Rico. It's important to note that the energy mix there is 97% imported fossil fuels, this being the reality on an island that has abundant sun. There also have been more recent controversies, particularly with LUMA, which is a joint venture between Canadian and US corporations. And so it's the privatization essentially of the public utility, the energy utility. And this has led to inaccessible documents that aren't in Spanish for people who are relying on the electricity grid. It has led for calls for the director of LUMA to potentially be imprisoned and arrested. There have been widespread blackouts and ongoing contributions to individuals suffering there who are dealing with what happens, what are the potentially deadly consequences when the power goes out for people who require dialysis or oxygen therapy or need to have refrigerated medicine, and many other concerns. And what has been in the news lately, in addition to LUMA, is the appropriation of FEMA funds. So there are almost $10 billion that have been set aside in these recovery funds from FEMA in response to the hurricanes, the earthquakes, and COVID. And this is for supporting the electric grid and transmission and distribution system in Puerto Rico with electricity. And so there are efforts to really continue pushing fracked liquefied natural gas and continuing to have Puerto Rico be very reliant on fossil fuels and these centralized forms of energy. And then there are really important counter efforts, which I'm going to talk about today, that embraces the importance of solar energy that's community-based, that's organized by community members, that's maintained by community members, that is distributed, it's on the top of rooftops. It uses battery and energy storage systems, and a host of other really important counter proposals to the status quo and ongoing reliance on fossil fuels that are imported. And so this situation has led to disproportionate impacts in the form of environmental racism and energy sacrifice zones, particularly in Afro-descendant and Black communities in Puerto Rico, including in the Hobos Bay, which I'll be talking about today. And then there's also the pandemic, of course. And so, as in other parts of the world, Puerto Rico is experiencing tremendous surges with the Omicron variant. And so, speaking of the pandemic and the importance of addressing environmental racism and energy sacrifice zones, I wanted to highlight a quotation from Mabel Colon Perez, who is a member of the Comunidad Guayamesa Unidos por tu Salud, which is a local group resisting a coal-fired power plant, which I'll be talking about. And she's also a student and a very talented artist. So this is a self-portrait of herself that you see here. And in an interview with another local community member and activist, Victor Alvarado Guzman, Mabel talks about that local politicians and others, are interested in trying to reduce the spread of coronavirus. But in fact, there's, to use her words, una plaga mayor. There's a larger plague that has to be the center of people's attention. So it's not so much COVID-19 that is the greatest exigency in her community, but it's actually this company with the 3 letters of AES. So this speaks to a US-owned corporation that has been running since, I believe, 2002, a coal-fired power plant that I'll be talking about in Puerto Rico that has led to a host of horrible health consequences for those who live most close to this polluting plant. So here you can see there's the planta de carbón that's on the right of the screen. That shows its location in the Hobos Bay area. And then in addition to that, there's also the Aguirre complex, which is a thermoelectric plant. So you have these 2 major polluters disproportionately sited in this small area, sharing this bay and its resources and impacting residents. And so there have been a number of studies that show that because of heavy metals and many other contaminants, there are elevated problems with respiratory illnesses and cardiovascular problems. There are a number of reproductive injustices, including spontaneous abortions. There's a clear cancer cluster very close to where this coal plant is, and many other issues. So I wanted to be sure to highlight that and to show the importance of science and community knowledge as people share what their lived experiences are and the health consequences of that. So here you can see the coal plant. This is a photo that I took back in 2014 or 2015. There have been many controversies with this coal plant. One was about what to do with the toxic coal ash that was generated. Typically, there's you can sort of see it here, but it's usually much larger, a mountain of coal ash. And And they're through the dispersal with, tropical winds, as you can imagine, and also very severe winds with like hurricanes. This has been dispersed throughout the communities. There was also a controversy with where to deposit this coal ash, because the plant was created without ever having a clear, safe deposit. And then there have been a host of other controversies within where the ash has ended up in different countries, including in La República Dominicana and in parts of Florida as well. So that's just a brief overview of some of the controversies with that plant. And then here's the thermoelectric plant that I was talking about earlier in Aguirre. And here is Erico Lonzayas, a local artist and filmmaker. And you can see that his home that he shares with his mother, Maria, is fence lined with this complex. So you can imagine the noise pollution, the air pollution, the light pollution that is incessant, in addition to many other disruptions to trying to live a good life and a peaceful life there. There are important alternatives. And so I want to go ahead and highlight this civil society proposal, Queremos Sol, or We Want Sun. This is available at the website that I have on this screen. And there you can see in English and Spanish what this proposal entails. And then, as I was talking about earlier, there are efforts to have distributed rooftop solar. Many structures in Puerto Rico have flat roofs, so it's fairly easy installation. And also the importance of having these decentralized systems rather than relying on a central system. So in the case of an earthquake, those centralized systems have failed. In case of hurricanes, the transmission and distribution system is incredibly vulnerable if we think about wires and different posts and how that can't hold up to hurricane force winds, in addition to many other concerns. So if you'd like to learn more about this proposal, I certainly would encourage you to check out the important messages being communicated there. One group that supports Queremos Sol, this proposal, is Idebajo. This is a grassroots group, and that stands for the Iniciativa de Ecodesarrollo de Valle de Obos, or the Eco Development Initiative of Obos Bay. And I have had the honor to be able to collaborate with different members of Idebajo for many years, since 2014, in different collaborative projects from my position in the diaspora. And Idebajo does a lot of mutual support, or apoyo mutuo, and autogestión initiatives. So thinking about the exercise of self-determination with sharing different resources to try to build alternatives and not wait on the state, which often has lethal agendas in terms of the consequences for the most marginalized, most oppressed communities. Idebajo also often partners with a number of other groups, including the Environmental Dialogue Committee, which I'll talk about shortly. And then some of the members who do work with Idebajo and the Environmental Dialogue Committee are also part of the Casa Comunitaria de Medios, including Eri, who I shared on a previous slide, doing different filmmaking projects and offering workshops. You can see the very vibrant, lively efforts that are constituting life and culture in this area. And this Environmental Dialogue Committee offers annually, just to exemplify some of the amazing work that people are doing despite all of the obstacles and barriers and injustices. This Dialogue Committee offers every year an environmental justice camp where students who are from this marginalized and oppressed community are able to learn about their community from fellow students, from elders in the community, based on different ecological knowledges, learning about leadership, learning about communication and science and the role of art. So this is an image that I took in 2014 when I was able to participate in this event. And so there you can see an early morning bird watching experience. And in the background, importantly, you have the ruins of what was the sugarcane industry in this particular plant and facility. And so the ongoing effects of racial capitalism still are with this community in many ways, in terms of what is still occupying a particular space, in addition to those electric energy power plants that I was talking about previously as well. Importantly, before I talk about my own book, I wanted to highlight a book that talks about this environmental justice camp and also these struggles in Puerto Rico in the Lobos Bay area. So Dr. Hilda Llorens is an anthropologist who has done a lot of work on the coal ash controversies with the AES coal plant, a lot of work with environmental justice and exposing environmental racism. So her book recently came out by the University of Washington this past November. And as you can see from this title, it's about Afro-Puerto Rican women co-creating and building environmental justice together. So there are a number of remarkable contributions that this book makes. It's very poignant, it's very powerful. This book offers concepts like matriarchal dispossession. It also talks about Black ecological knowledges, significantly from Dr. Llorens's perspective, using autoethnography. So in addition to the book that I'll talk about that I wrote, I wanted to be sure to highlight Dr. Llorens's tremendous contributions. So this is the book that I wrote that was published by the University of California Press this past year. And I wanted to talk about a couple aspects of this text before I talk about some of the additional public-facing projects that I've done. And so before I do that, I just wanted to acknowledge that this cover is Mabet Colon Perez's beautiful work, and it comes from a photograph that we had of Coqui Solar members. So this is a solar community collective working at a local community center to try to ensure that there's distributed rooftop solar for the most marginalized individuals in the community who would face the greatest risks if there was a power outage, and there are often those outages and blackouts. And so Mabet used her creative talents to take this photograph and these members of this group to also try to situate it clearly marking the archipelago of Puerto Rico and also these struggles with the distribution lines, as you can see, and then also solar energy. So I'll talk a little bit about Coqui Solar later, but it's just one of numerous examples in terms of how people are taking power literally into their own hands to try to transform systems that are not working and that carry tremendous risks for life and living good lives in Puerto Rico. So in this book, I talk about transforming power in many forms and reclaiming energy. So not thinking about power and any energy only in electricity terms, but thinking about people power, thinking about the role of labor in terms of social movement actors and activists, of community members, and a variety of other related connections there. I also am interested in metaphor as a communication studies scholar. So each chapter has what I call an energy metaphor of exigence. So I talk about amplifying, disempowering, and empowering, as well as experimenting, also generating, rewiring, and delinking as being these key metaphors that also have very strong material components, particularly if you were to think about rewiring and what that might mean, not only technologically, but thinking about our relationships. What might that mean to create more sustainable relationships and being in community with others? I also talk about a number of key terms. So previously I mentioned archipelagos of power. I also talk about energy coloniality and how that gets communicated and disrupted, as well as energy privilege and energy justice. And in particular, in talking about energy justice, I argue that there are 4 Ds of this social movement discourse and this frame. So this would be decarbonization, decentralization, democratization, and decolonization. And I argue that without all 4 of those elements, it would be very easy to just replicate oppressive power dynamics just with a different technology, like with renewables, for example. And so I'm thinking about these problems and possibilities. The book focuses on coalitional organizing and relationships, particularly in the form of e-advocacy, to think about how can distanced communication occur using digital spaces, electronic spaces. And so the projects that I'm talking about today certainly are enactments of that e-advocacy. And in this book, I also draw heavily and create narratives that are historically based and autoethnographic in terms of my methods. And you see here, there's a photo of Titi Consi, my great aunt in Puerto Rico, and me visiting. Titi Consi passed away shortly after Hurricane Maria in 2017, but here I was visiting her 3 years before when she was doing much better. So you can see that there are family components of the narrative that I share. And so these take shape in what I call roots or routes, raíces. There's a bit of a play with the words there, to offer the story behind the story in writing Energy Islands. So in addition to my family relationships, I also talk about my great challenges ethically, you know, someone who's Puerto Rican, Spanish, and Irish American woman who grew up in the US diaspora, and really thinking about whether or not I have the right to tell particular stories, how I tell those stories, in consultation with whom, and all of these other related issues. So in the book, I talk about, before Hurricane Maria, having withdrawn a book manuscript with a different press that initially had received positive reviews. And I decided to withdraw it because I just felt like I wasn't the person to tell these stories. And then Hurricane Maria hit after Irma, and there were a number of necessities that had to be addressed. And so the diasporic members became key collaborators, with a lot of individuals being most impacted in Puerto Rico. And after those experiences and their ongoing relationships, I felt, maybe I do have something to share and to reflect on through that experience. So that's why this book that is now available was something that I wanted to actually write the second time around. So if you want to learn more about the book, there is a link to my website, catalinadeonis.com, and the other projects I'm sharing are also available there. So in my field work, as I was chatting with people, including Ruth Tata Santiago, who I had mentioned earlier, I would ask questions like, what gives you energy, or que te da ánimo to continue in these struggles for a more livable world, more livable communities? And I wanted to highlight Tata's response here. And I should say that she is on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. She has been a fierce defender of people's ability to survive and live good lives in Puerto Rico, particularly in the Jobos Bay, for many, many years. For these efforts, she won the Sierra Club's Robert Bullard Environmental Justice Award a couple of years ago. And there are many, many other contributions that she has made throughout the years as an environmental justice lawyer and community member and leader and person who inspires many individuals. So I want to acknowledge her labor for decades. And so you can see in this exchange, when I ask her what gives you energy, she talks about the importance of people contributing what they can. And sometimes people will surprise you with what they're able to contribute in these efforts. She also notes the importance of combativeness. And so having a formidable foe, an opponent in these struggles, and really rallying to try to confront them and expose their corruption and expose how they're contributing to injustice. So that's just one of many responses that people would share as I was doing field work. And as you can see in Tata's responses there, her comments are about people power, so how people can collectively work together. And so in addition to the academic book, a second project that I've been working on is the El Poder del Pueblo documentary, the Power of the People documentary. And so this was released last fall, and this has been very much a collaborative effort. There were two of us from the US diaspora who worked on this project, who have Puerto Rican roots, but for the most part, it was community members in the most impacted areas telling their own stories in their own terms. And so that was a very important disruption to a lot of extractivist filmmaking that particularly accelerated in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, where people from outside would come and extract the stories that they wanted and then just take them up and communicate them as they wanted. So El Poder del Pueblo is a very different project that has worked hard to compensate community members for their contributions. So for example, Jose Luis Chema Bayerga, who you'll see on a future slide, was the producer and co-director of this film. And this was the first project that he had shared with me where he's received compensation for doing the work that he loves. So the importance of ensuring that people are supported in telling their community stories and doing the work that they want to do in this world has been part of some of the interventions and disruptions that this project seeks to make. So here on the documentary's website, you can see what screen or image will greet you. So you can watch the trailer as well as access the full film. And importantly, to try to disrupt extractivist approaches, we've had a number of screenings of this film in the most impacted communities first. So this is from a virtual screening that was offered in English and Spanish back in October. Before we had this screening, though, importantly, there was a pre-screening done among Y Debajo members in Puerto Rico. And there also was then a screening done in a community most impacted by the coal-fired power plants in the Guayama region. And so we wanted to start there because, of course, these are the communities whose stories are being shared, and it was very important to receive their perspectives on how they were interpreting the final product or the in-progress product to adjust as needed or to take their comments seriously. And after that, we had this digital presentation, and since then I've shown the film in a couple of other spaces. In addition to recognizing Ruth Santiago here and Chema, the director, here you can see an image of Mabet, who I've been talking about, and her father, Alberto Colon. Here is Eri, who we saw earlier beside the thermoelectric plant. And here's Carmen de Jesus, who was an interviewee in this film and has a number of really important roles. I wanted to share a quotation from Gadman, who always has very profound things to say from her perspective as a woman in the community. And so she has a variety of roles, including serving as Y Debajo secretary and being a community organizer in a variety of efforts, including that Coqui Solar community project I was talking about. But here she had shared with me the importance of community projects and making dreams realities, and the importance of rescuing social ties that were created by their ancestors, and the importance of caring and for and sharing what different community members have, worrying and having concern for others, and demonstrating love and empathy. And so I think this is a really important message in thinking about how communities re-energize themselves amid these very serious challenges and injustices. The film has been screened at the Vieques Film and Human Rights Festival, and hopefully other film festivals will have interest in this film. In addition to the documentary and related to the documentary, I also had the joy of collaborating on an environmental justice children's book. And here you can see it's bilingual, and it had many co-authors. And so I think it's very important to acknowledge these different individuals. And so I will do that now. This was a very life-giving project and really a joy. So here we have Mabet, who I've been talking about, and she did both the illustrations, including of her family members, as you see here. And she also shared her narrative, her eco-testimonial or testimony of what it is like to live by the coal plant, and how her organizing shows how local young people can become change makers and how that can take shape. So Mabet has been an amazing collaborator in these projects. And also I want to acknowledge Dr. Illy Llorens, who I had mentioned previously, and also her son, Khalil Garcia Llorens, who was an important co-author. I believe Khalil is finishing up his middle school years. And they were amazing in helping me to think about how to communicate to younger audiences, because they have shared many days reading together as parent and child. And so here you can see the illustrations that Mabet made of them as well that are in the book. This book, importantly, was published by an independent Puerto Rican press, so it was important to us to support a publishing entity like this. And I want to particularly acknowledge Dr. Lisette Orlon Collazo and Dr. Beatriz Yanin Figueroa, who were integral in supporting this project. And they've supported other projects, as you can see with this image on this slide, that speak to a lot of the same issues. If you would like to hear Mabet speak with Dr. Ron Guayaso and others with Editora Educación Emergente, there is a conversation in Spanish available on my website. If you click the Environmental Justice is for You and Me link. I also have a couple of things to say in that link, but most importantly, Mabet's voice is featured, and she has some very important things to say about her perspective on the project. So here you can see from the book, there are a number of images that demonstrate both the beauty of the area, but also the pollution. And here you can see intergenerational uses of different spaces in the Bay Area, and also how culture is so important, such as dancing to the different movements for change and trying to disrupt the status quo. Here you can see other images as well from the book. And then this image is toward the end of the text, and you can see the cangrejo and the mangles, the mangroves and the crab, and the students are off to school in a healthy environment, imagining what the future can and should be for these different young community members. And importantly, this book is available for free PDF download on the publisher's website, Editora Educación Emergente, and there's also a book for purchase if anyone is interested in paperback. And with this project, it was so important to ensure the book got into the hands of the people whose stories motivated, necessitated the telling of this narrative. So here are students from the environmental justice camp that I mentioned previously. It's called Convivencia Ambiental, and this was from this summer. So the 2021 camp during the pandemic. And here you can see that the children's book was included in the programming. And then I want to acknowledge that there are many organizers who make this event possible every year with their volunteer labor. So Yaminet Rodriguez is over here in the corner, and she's been an amazing supporter of this event for many, many years. This book also was part of the Aula en la Montaña curriculum or event. Dr. Sandra Soto Santiago at the University of Puerto Rico, I believe Rio Piedras Recinto, she, for International Literacy Day, organized programming so that students in that program could learn about the book and read it and get their own copy. So it's been wonderful to see this book find young readers so that that message can spread. Also in Oregon, I was able to offer a two-part workshop that involved reading the book and then students creating their own environmental justice texts based on their experiences or issues that they cared about or wanted to learn more about. And so this was with Willamette Academy students. This is a college access program that's primarily for Latina, Latino, Latinx students who are in middle school and high school, and also students who are coming from low income and low wealth communities. And so this was an event that was great fun to experience with them. Here we are reading the book, and then you can see some of the finished creations in the form of zines or do-it-yourself little magazines to tell their own stories. Also, I had the joy of presenting to 500 elementary schoolers this book in 2 different reading sessions this past November. So you can see that the stack of books, 500 copies, was a lot to distribute. So it was wonderful to reach younger readers, particularly the school that had dual language programs and that works very hard to try to center other languages other than English in a lot of its programming. So those are just some of the ways that this book has reached a variety of audiences. And then in reflecting in this project, I did write a critical peer-reviewed piece about the process, reflecting on it, the writing of the book. And so in a Frontiers in Communication article that's open access that can be found by that name, I talk about technology and communication barriers. So some of the obstacles we encountered as collaborators, included blackouts or unreliable electricity access, differences in preferences with communication using WhatsApp versus email. And so I reflect on some of those issues. I also talk about funding and accessibility. This project actually cost a lot of money to make in both creating the no-cost download in PDF format and also the paperback book itself. And so that required both personal funds from those of us who collaborated on the project, as well as some of my university funds. So I'm very grateful for the startup funds that I had to make this project possible. And also it's very important to compensate Mabet for her labor and contributions in this project. So that was a key commitment and priority for us. And then also accessibility, to get this book into the hands of many individuals. It was important to purchase the books and then ship them, mail them. So those are some other factors that I talk about in this piece. And then also translation in many senses of the word, but in thinking about the scholarly acceptability of a project of this kind, how to make this project legible in terms of being one that was academic, that should be valued, that should be viewed as relevant. Because certainly in preparing this project, there was an importance of centering younger readers, so thinking about audience, voice, thinking about storytelling, thinking about the importance of multilingualism, and so much more. So that's certainly a challenge in thinking about how these projects get received, I think, in some academic circles, particularly for thinking about review, tenure, and promotion. So with some of those reflections on this project, I wanted to thank you all for joining today, and I welcome conversation on these three projects and any other ideas that you might have. Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Professor Onís, for this wonderful presentation and really inspiring too. I have a number of questions, but I want to first encourage the audience and remind them that there's a Q&A box where they can leave their questions. But I'm just going to go ahead and start with my first question. The last seminar that we had in the virtual seminar series, Professor Amy Gonzalez from University of California, Santa Barbara, talked about the notion of technology maintenance, right? And she said that she believes that in the near future, one of the key variables in the digital divide will be that of how can people maintain in a good condition their technological devices. And among the good conditions of the technological devices, she referred to the capacity of the energy to be sustainable across time. That is, the idea that people don't have energy cuts or like energy deficits, right? That they can actually plug in their phone to an energy source and that their phone will be available to function, etc. And she said that this is generally overlooked in discussions about digital media use. And actually digital media is basically, of course, its infrastructure is the actual functioning of energetic sources. So I want to ask you, how do you see the connection between this idea of technology maintenance, this idea of its intrinsic connection to digital divides, and people's struggles for assuring that they have environmental justice?
I think that's a very important insight that presenter was highlighting. And I think we see, if we were to bring in some of my research into that conversation, that there are some really clear issues and connections that have to be grappled with in terms of inequities and injustices. And thinking about, yes, if that power source isn't available, okay, maybe there's technology access, which is an issue in and of itself to ensure that that's there. But yes, how can these technologies be maintained? And if there isn't a power source, if there are these regular disruptions or prolonged outages, maybe months at a time, as was seen with Hurricane Maria, how can people communicate? And what alternative technologies can perhaps be can be drawn on to support these apoyo mutuo, these mutual aid or mutual support efforts? So thinking about chargers that run on solar power, for example. What are other technologies that could be relied on? Generators that don't pollute the environment, like diesel generators, which was such a problem with the noise and carbon monoxide poisoning and all these other factors that have to be considered. So I think this interconnected approach, looking at all the intersections and also looking at what tends to get overlooked and what might be some of the assumptions that people might bring to these different projects or these different lived experiences is very important. So what are the encounters of individuals the experiences of individuals who are facing these greatest injustices, the largest and most growing threats, and how might that shift perhaps how some conversations unfold, and what is the role of privilege and precarity in thinking about these very significant issues of life and death, and how community members can sustain themselves. And as I was saying, have these communication networks, these archipelagos of power to come together and to continue to try to live amid some very difficult conditions, if you think about hurricanes or a host of other disasters that should be considered. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because that's not something that I've thought about as much with like social movement organizing necessarily, in terms of not just the access to the technology, but how that technology can be maintained. So certainly important for that e-advocacy concept I was talking about too. So thank you for that.
No, thank you so much, Professor Denise. I believe we have a question from Valerie Roost. She will activate her camera now.
Thank you so much for this wonderful and truly impactful presentation. And as you and Mora were just mentioning, that's part of my question, actually, how you mentioned in your work, how you've had a focus on coalitional organizing and relationships, as well as media and technology. And really, I'm wondering, in times of struggle and during times of change, what was the power of e-advocacy that you observed as you navigated through these complex dynamics, especially considering access disparities to technology? And also, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on the importance of culture to the different movements for change, such as how you mentioned in your presentation, the power of art and music. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Val. Yeah, in chapter 4 of my book about this rewiring, not only of technology, but in different relationships, socially and politically, one of the things that I talk about is the difficulty when, community members who are being most impacted get cut off from being able, to communicate with different news media who potentially could spread the word about, some issue or try to call attention to FEMA funds or something else. How does one in a diasporic role, in my case, help to support these efforts with communication without speaking for or speaking over? And sometimes there are cases where one, with the consent of those individuals, does speak for. I am thinking of different news media efforts where a number of collaborators and I were able to take a handwritten testimony from Ruth Santiago, who I'd been mentioning, and to type that up and share that with Latino rebels, for example, to get that testimony out because Ruth was not able to and had all these other exertions, that were required with time and energy. So just thinking about how to navigate that ethically, and thinking about one's role in the community in that regard. And it can certainly help if someone already has established trust, already has community ties with those different individuals. And one of the problems we saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria was people, trying to swoop in who had no connection to Puerto Rico, who saw this just as an opportunity to, potentially write an interesting essay or, make a documentary. And so really what my book tries to call attention to, and hopefully these projects call attention to, is the importance of sustained long-term deep commitment, where an academic agenda is far to the side compared to the well-being of individuals and what these projects might do to harm or to help, and to really think about that. And then your second question was about the important role of culture and art and music. If you watch the documentary El Poder del Pueblo, you will see that Eddie, in addition to being an amazing editor who made the trailer for our film and being a great videographer, he's also a really accomplished artist with rap. And so you'll hear him using this genre to try to communicate his lived experiences. So there are just so many examples of people drawing on their numerous talents to try to communicate in these different expressive forms. So you might be interested in watching the documentary.
Thank you, Dr. Onís. We do have a question from the audience. Ruth Santiago asks, can you discuss the role of social media in addressing environmental and climate justice?
Well, Ruth, Tata, thank you so much for joining today. All of these projects have been shaped greatly by her insights and her struggles. So I want to acknowledge my dear friend and collaborator. Thank you. I think I have learned from people in the Horos Bay that social media is so important. I think about WhatsApp and how many of us rely on this, and Facebook, and then just other texts, you know, and the real challenges, you know, Tata, is you've experienced much more than I have, but also our shared experience in trying to find, you know, Wi-Fi hubs, you know, in the aftermath of Maria, like 2 months later, and even beyond that. So really thinking about that, the important role of social media and how people are communicating and how to navigate preferences in different platforms. I find that sometimes challenging. So I will know that, you know, some people prefer to communicate, you know, on WhatsApp, and others prefer Facebook. And, you know, so some of us have a lot of Facebook fatigue and, you know, try to separate ourselves from that, or the technology just doesn't seem as accessible or whatever it might be. So I think social media is incredibly important. But when we have this dispersion of, you know, the different ways that we can communicate, it can also, you know, be an energy drain to try to, you know, communicate to these different channels and try to reach everyone as much as possible, which is incredibly important. But it's also just more time and energy and taking up mental space as, you know, we're trying to engage these different struggles. So I certainly learned a lot throughout this process regarding that, including younger folks. You know, with the different individuals who I was mentioning, you know, how are they communicating and what are their preferred modes of communication? And how do some of us older people have to learn how to use those different platforms to reach the people we want to be in community with?
I think it's so interesting that the first platform that you mentioned when you're asked about social media is WhatsApp. I think that WhatsApp is such a special platform for communication across different generations. And that probably makes it, I mean, of course, you are the expert on this, but I think that it might be used for cross-generational communication, because at least from what I've seen in a different context in Argentina, really it's like probably the only platform that is used by people of all ages, literally. So I guess it must be a super important tool, right, for environmental justice activism, right?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's one of many. And I'm not a social media expert. I wouldn't say that is my area of specialty, but I've learned a lot, you know, through different social movement organizing efforts. But that is important to note. So are there platforms where intergenerationally there seem to be more people who can identify with what's being offered on that particular platform, to think about how we're using our communicative energies and how in these different efforts, you know, the most people can be included who need to be involved in these communication efforts. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that and thinking about, yeah, the case of Argentina. I know where I have, you know, relatives elsewhere. Certainly, yes, there are some older folks who are using WhatsApp. So that's a great comment.
Thank you, Professor. I believe we have one more question from Facundo Suenzo. He will activate his camera.
Thank you, Mora. Thank you, Professor Onís, for this incredible talk, really timely talk. Thank you very much. I have a question. Here, right now in Argentina, a salient topic in the public opinion is the tension between progress or economic growth and environment or environmental care or climate change. And I think that there is a very pressing question for developing countries right now after the pandemic, or but while we continue with the pandemic, I would say. So I guess that my question, I was wondering if you saw this tension like between like economic development or economic growth and environmental justice or climate change, and how those audiences that you research navigate this tension. I think that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. I see in a lot of different spaces those who have the most to gain from maintaining the status quo, trying to create these binaries of well, it's, can be environmentally friendly, or it can lead to these more sustainable relationships and technologies, or there's jobs in the economy, and, this has to be focused on. And I think what Hobos Bay community members show, and other people in Puerto Rico, like with labor unions, with the energy utility there, they demonstrate that there's an alternative path forward that doesn't have to be this either or. So, one of the efforts with community solar projects in the Hobos Bay area is to create jobs for people. So you'll have these much more sustainable, electric energy sources for generation, and people can go to school and learn about how to be electricians. And there are local youth who can lead different efforts to explain how electric energy gets generated. And so I think the challenge for those of us who believe that we can have a much more equitable, sustainable, livable future by foregrounding the importance of environmental justice and fighting environmental racism and all of these other issues, climate justice, energy justice. I think our real challenge is, how do we communicatively combat and overpower, use our collective power and our savvy with our strategic communication, different tactics we might use to try to communicate those alternatives. And so what we see in the Queremos Sol proposal is very much a clear roadmap for how jobs can be generated, how distributed renewables can be implemented. So then the real challenge is how to build these alternatives. And so we see in this region of Puerto Rico, for example, people, as I was saying, literally taking power into their own hands to try to show that these alternatives can exist. That doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that it isn't discouraging. It doesn't mean that there aren't, internal disagreements. All of these things exist. But I think in looking at people who are trying to build, those alternative realities already, there's a lot to learn from those groups.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catalina. This was a fabulous seminar and a very, very important topic. So thank you very much for sharing your research with us today. Thank you, Mora, for great moderation. Thank you to our audience for staying with us through the end. And I wish everybody a great week. And I invite people to join us for next week's seminar of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Have a wonderful rest of your days. Bye now.